Good morning. Last week we talked about different types of community interactions, but we did not talk about symbiosis, which is another important community interaction we need to discuss. Symbiosis has to do with different organisms living together in ways that either benefit or hurt the organisms. So our goal today is to answer what is symbiosis, what are some different kinds, and what are some examples. So first of all, symbiosis, the word, you can often understand terms in biology if you know some of the root words. So sym means same, and bio means life, and sis means together. So same, life, together, the active organisms living together. So this happens a lot in nature. Obviously, it's hard to find organisms all alone. They're often interacting with other organisms, and sometimes those interactions help. Sometimes they hurt. So it involves two organisms that live together, could be temporary or for a longer time period. At least one of the organism is going to benefit from this relationship. So the three kinds of symbiosis are mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So mutualism is green here because both organisms benefit. Commensalism is blue because one benefits and one is unaffected. And parasitism is one benefits and one is harmed. That's why it's red, as one of them is harmed. And so you kind of have two thumbs up. One thumb up, one organism, meh. And then parasitism, one thumb up, one thumb down. So we can think of some examples of where we might see this in nature, different organisms living together. So here are some classic examples. Here we have an acacia plant and ants. Ants are laying eggs on an acacia tree, so they get a nice safe place to lay their eggs. The acacia covers the infected area with brown flesh. The plant has to use valuable resources to create this flesh or gall. So what symbiotic relationship is this? Well, the ants are certainly benefiting at the expense of the tree, and that's often the case with insects and vegetation. Most of the time the insects are harmful, except for beneficial insects like ladybugs, which we'll talk about. But that was an example of parasitism. How about this one, the anemone and the anemone fish? So here what we have is a fish that lives its entire adult life among the tentacles of a bulb tentacle sea anemone. Anemone fish do not get stung by the anemone as would most other fish, so they get the protection from predators. The fish often drop food scraps which the anemones can eat. So what kind of symbiosis do you think is happening here? Well, it's mutualism. The fish is going to benefit from the protection, but the anemone is going to be relatively unaffected. Let's do a couple more, but I want to switch to a couple that you might find a little more interesting. This one's kind of cool, the moray eel and the cleaner fish. The moray eel has a small fish cleaning between its teeth. You can see it in this picture. That's pretty cool. The eel gets a clean mouth while the cleaner fish gets a nice white meal. So that one is definitely going to be, you tell me, that is mutualism. Both organisms are benefiting. Now here's one that might relate to our study in the Serengeti. So we have cattle and cattle egrets, and these actually, are they buffalo or are they cattle? I'm still working on my Serengeti Wildlife ID. But basically, as the cattle walk around eating grass, they stir up lots of insects. The insects feed the birds, the egrets, and they get food. The cattle are relatively unaffected. Symbiosis. This one is commensalism because the cattle are not affected, although I think those might be buffalo. Let's look at this next picture. Is a little bit gross, so if you don't want to look, this is a parasitism example. So this is the Loa Loa worm in a human. not very common around here, but the worm infects humans in the bloodstream and gets a nice, safe, warm home. So a parasite, a human, may go blind. So that's obviously going to be bad for us if we get the loa worm. So go ahead and avoid that one. I'm going to pause the video. Okay, so shifting gears here. Last week we talked about the energy pyramid and trophic levels and food chains, and one of the big ideas last week was that energy flows through an ecosystem. It doesn't get destroyed, it gets degraded into heat. But this week I want to talk about how nutrients cycle through an ecosystem. And you're probably familiar with the carbon cycle from earth science and the storage of carbon dioxide in rocks and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the burning of fossil fuels. And that's a really important cycle. In this class we're going to focus on the nitrogen cycle, which you probably haven't heard much about. So nitrogen is a really important element for life, primarily because it's an element that's present in something called an amino acid. And what amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, which are essentially the structural components of your body. So nitrogen is a really important element for living things. If you think to our eutrophication activities with algae, we were adding nutrients, and one of those some of those nutrients were in the form of nitrogen or nitrates that we gave the algae to help it grow. So let's take a look at this diagram here and try to understand how nitrogen moves around the ecosystems. And the first thing we should start with here is up at the top in the atmosphere. So this is just a diagram out of your textbook on page 84, and I'm going to walk you through this. And really there's some other nutrient cycles that you don't really have to know about. We're going to just hold you accountable for the nitrogen cycle in this class. So let's start up here in the atmosphere. Most of the atmosphere, about 70%, is nitrogen gas, or N2. So you'd think that, boy, there's this abundance of nitrogen, why doesn't everything just grow? Well, there's kind of this problem that nitrogen can't just be absorbed from the air by plants. So if I'm here as crops in a field growing, I'm going to need nitrogen, but I can't just get it from the air. Nitrogen has to follow a pathway to make its way into the soil first, and then plants can absorb nitrogen from their root systems. So this first step is pretty important. The nitrogen gas is turned into fertilizer and applied to crops. So this would be a human involved pathway where we're actually producing synthetic fertilizer that we can give to the crops. But how does it happen in a natural way? So this text box here was following this orange line of synthetic nitrogen fixation is what it's called. So typically, before humans invented agriculture, this job of nitrogen fixation, or getting it out of the air and into the soil, was accomplished by bacteria. And what they do is a really important process called nitrogen fixation, where bacteria convert nitrogen gas into ammonia. And once that nitrogen is in a chemical compound called ammonia, or NH3, it can then be absorbed by plants' roots. And so here's that compound, NH3, which in the presence of water will dissociate into a nitrite and a nitrate ion. So you can see those polyatomic ions with the charges associated with them here. So bacteria, it turns out, are really, really important in this cycle. If we didn't have them, we wouldn't be able to get nitrogen from the air to the plants. So as the plants grow and develop, there's this cycle here where it's showing that the plants are taking up nitrogen from the soil, and then animals are eating those plants and getting nitrogen from the plants. And then eventually the animals die, or the plants die, and they decompose, and then they're going to be broken down by bacteria once again, and that nitrogen goes back into the soil. So this is one important pathway of nitrogen fixation. And then how does the nitrogen get back into the atmosphere? So ultimately, bacteria can release that nitrogen back to the atmosphere as well, which is a process called denitrification. But more important than denitrification is nitrogen fixation, getting the nitrogen into the soil. So like we talked about with eutrophication, this orange arrow here is showing the pathway of some dissolved nitrogen in water. When it gets in the water, it's not a great thing because, as we know, then it's going to promote the growth of the algae, and we can get that eutrophication process that we keep talking about. So the main message with this nutrient cycle is that nitrogen is a key nutrient for plants to grow. It's super abundant in the atmosphere, but very limited in the soil. And one of the key players of this cycle is the bacteria to bring that atmospheric into a usable form for plants. There is one other pathway I want to talk about, this red arrow, which is this physical or chemical pathway when nitrogen can sometimes be fixed by lightning. What that means is when lightning happens, it basically is splitting up air molecules, and it can take N2 and it can fix it into the soil where the lightning strikes and create an area of increased fertility due to the nitrogen in that soil. Now this is kind of an exception. Most of the nitrogen is coming through nitrogen fixation and not from lightning strikes, but it is an important pathway to at least be aware of. Okay, so that is the nitrogen cycle, and I'm going to leave you with this. Nutrients do not get used up. So this whole time, there's a certain number of nitrogen atoms present in the biosphere, and those atoms simply cycle around our planet and never get used up. They just become incorporated into living things, and then when those living things die, they move into different reservoirs like the soil or back into the air. So energy flows and is degraded, nutrients cycle and are never used up. Kind of like the water cycle. In the water cycle, water molecules aren't destroyed. The carbon cycle, carbon molecules aren't destroyed. And one other thing I want to mention here with plant growth and ecosystem productivity is sometimes we can limit the productivity of an ecosystem if there's a nutrient limitation or a limiting nutrient. And oftentimes that is going to be nitrogen. So an important symbiosis is for trees, bacteria and a fungus called mycorrhizae that exist on the roots of trees that help them get more nitrogen into their roots. And so in that case, that'd be a mutualistic relationship. All right, that's it.